Um, Hi, hello. Thank you for joining us today at the webinar about conflict of interest. Before I start, I wanted to check if everyone can hear me and see me. If you could maybe write something in the chat box. Okay, great. Perfect. Now I can welcome you officially in the webinar about conflict of interest. My name is Marianna Sikorowska, and I'm the Governance Officer at the Alliance. I will not keep the camera for the entire presentation. I think in about 2 slides, I will switch it off, so you'll only be able to hear my voice. So don't worry about this. It's nothing. There is no technical issue. I just wanted you to see my face, but then later I will switch it off. So before we start, I have a couple of housekeeping items. The webinar will last for approximately 1 hour. I'll be talking for about 45 minutes. And the webinar will be recorded. So you can access this afterwards on our members section on our website. There will be a webinar with slides and also with any additional resources that I'll mention during the webinar. I'll also ask you a couple of questions, so it would be good if you could all participate and answer this. And this time it will be in the format of true or false. And finally, you will have a chance to ask me questions in the Q&A part at the end of the webinar. But also, if you do have questions during the webinar, you can ask them in the chat box below. I will try to answer them straight away. And if not, I'll get back to them later. And I just have a small favor to ask you. Well, due to the topic of the webinar, please do not disclose any personal disputes. If you do have questions that will involve more details, you can also ask it to me later, and I'll get back to you via email. I'm going to switch off the camera right now, and then we can move on to the main part of the presentation. Right, so today we'll be talking about what is conflict of interest and what are the different types of conflict, how to identify this. So once you can identify this, what are the best ways to manage the conflict of interest? And finally, what are the risks associated with non-compliance? I guess that maybe some of you will be thinking during the webinar, oh, this is exactly what is happening to my organization. I need to find a solution to this. Well, there's no magical solutions. I can share with you some practical tips that if you would be able to implement, it will help you to reduce the chance that there will be a conflict of interest in the way that you make decisions. But hopefully by the end of the webinar, you become confident that conflicts of interest are just naturally happening in the organization. It's not a major problem as long as you can handle it in an appropriate way with common sense guidelines. What is a conflict of interest? I assume that most of you have already experienced this situation, and by now you will know that the definition will largely depend on the situation and the scenario. So for the sake of our webinar, we can the conflict of interest can be basically quite broad. As you can see in the definition on the slide, it can be a situation where a person or an organization could exploit a professional or official capacity for a personal or corporate benefit. So it basically comes down to the situation that a person or an organization will get an advantage just because he or she is directly, either indirectly involved in the decision-making process. It's not only the situation typical for board directors. Some definitions will also mention a term connected persons. It means it can be a partner, but it can be also a member, a stakeholder, a business partner, or another company. And I guess the easiest way to explain the concept of conflict of interest is to use some examples. A typical one can be a board director who is also providing consultancy services for the organization that he's sitting on the board. Or it can be an employee who's working for a company, but as well has a business, a side business that will compete with the core activities of his employer. Or it can be a board member who joined the organization and joins the board just to increase the chances that his products or services will be purchased by that organization. The Alliance Principles of Good Governance for Sport and Recreation also refer to the conflict of interest in two principles. In Principle 1, integrity, we mentioned basically what is also stated in the Companies Act and the Charities Act. So the fact that directors have a duty to promote the success of the company, and they cannot be involved in activities that will favor themselves or members or stakeholders. So here we put an importance on board behaviors, which is protecting integrity of the organization, and that directors should act in the best interest of the organization and have a duty to act objectively. And Principle 6, accountability and transparency, has a slightly different approach towards conflict of interest. So accountability focuses on more practical aspects, such as ensuring that board directors have a clear understanding of what can be classified as conflict of interest, that they will fill out their declaration of interests whenever there might be in a situation of a potential conflict of interest, but also they will do it regularly, at least once per year, and that each and then the transparency. It's about encouraging high standards of behavior. So it means that directors and employees will basically give a greater thought to their conduct if they can understand the organization's values and behaviors. There is many different types of conflicts that you can see, especially in literature. But I think from the practical aspect, I focused on the one which are the most common and quite sort of like the most simple. So you can see it on the left-hand side. And we can differentiate financial interest, conflict of interest, or non-financial. It can be direct or indirect. It can be personal or conflict of loyalties. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the examples of that. So for example, accepting a gift of a significant value would be a financial and direct conflict of interest, or indirect if it was accepted by a partner of a board director. And in that situation, the board director might be influenced by this making a decision. I guess when you are mentioning conflict of interest and the meeting minutes, at the Alliance we usually would say if it's basically a financial, direct or indirect conflict of interest. So that I also find it useful You don't have to go into so much details. Just simply describe what type of conflict of interest is that. Um, and then what is actually more important is finding out what type of conflicts of interest can arise. Not manage every conflict of interest. Um, and we can differentiate three types of conflicts of interest that can arise. It's real, potential, and perceived. And I will try to use examples to illustrate differences between each of them. When we are talking about the real or actual conflict of interest, it's basically when an individual has significant interest in the outcome decision. Imagine a situation when a board director is tasked to find a new office space for the organization, and that director will come up with the space in the building that he or she owns. This is clearly a situation of a real conflict of interest. And in most case scenario, maybe that director should resign. The potential conflict of interest is when you could be influenced by conflicting interests, but this is conditional to certain facts and circumstances occurring. So it's a situation that you need to recognize ahead of time, and also this potential allows you to foresee some circumstances that might require an action to reduce or remove the conflict of interest. It can be a situation when a board director is asked to mediate between two parties, and one of them is his close work colleague. Now, as if this director will mention this fact, that he knows his or her work colleague before the decision is made, the potential conflict of interest can be avoided. And most probably, either another person we ask to mediate, or this director would be still allowed to mediate if both parties, so first, know about this, and secondly, they are comfortable with that person being a mediator. Potential conflicts of interest are also quite common among sports agents, because sometimes they might use the bargaining position of one of their clients to sort of enforce a negotiating position of another client, or it can even happen that sometimes they will consciously or unconsciously sort of prefer or treat an interest of one client, give it more priority to the comparing to the interest of the other client. And finally, perceived conflict of interest is when an individual seems to have an interest in the outcome of a decision, but here you should be careful not to jump to conclusions too quickly, as it's important to investigate facts and circumstances first. Often this type of conflict causes disputes because people don't really know what exactly happened, but they have already made assumptions. It can be a scenario when, for example, one of the board directors will recommend his sister's business for consulting services for the organization where he's on board. And the conflict will arise the moment when his sister will show the interest in providing consultancy services. But if the organization have a specific criteria or a bid process that will allow to shortlist candidates that will fit those criteria, this can be avoided. And then if the director will be obviously not participating in choosing a final candidate, again, there is no conflict of interest. It can be also a scenario when a board director applies to be consultant for the organization that he sits on board. If he's not if he's not participating in the decision-making process to choose a final candidate, and he fits the criteria, then there is no conflict of interest situation, and it's just a perceived one. Well, I hope that this part was quite clear. I do have, as I mentioned, a couple of questions for you. And the first one, it's relatively easy, is so once again, please just answer if it's true or false, according to you. A conflict of interest is not only financial. And if you can press the send button in the end. Okay, I think most of you voted. There's two people that didn't, but I think I can end it right now. So yes, well, all of you did answer correctly. Well, from its definition, the conflict can be not only financial, can be non-financial, personal, etc. Great. It was an easy question. I have another one, which is a bit more tricky. If you could also answer it right now. So do you think that you can stay objective despite being in the conflict? Okay. I guess okay, some people are changing their minds. Okay. Well, so here, most of you said that you can stay objective, while 22% you cannot. I did say it's a tricky question, as I would tend to say that it's false. It's hard to stay objective. And the reason why is that if you do have an interest in the outcome of a decision, it's highly unlikely you can stay objective. I did talk about this with some of the directors, and I think it's mostly depends on the scenario. So, for example, if you have a director who sits on the board and applies to be a consultant, and you do have to take a decision on that, but let's say you don't have any consultancy, you don't offer any consultancy services, and you don't even know the topic that he has this expertise, it might be that you will not, that potentially you might be in a situation of conflict because you are sitting on the board and you know that director, but you're just basically not really familiar with the topic. But if you do have an interest in the outcome of a decision, so if you know that person closely, or if you do have, if you do offer similar consultancy services, it will be very unlikely that you will stay objective. So normally this question can cause some debate. As I can see here, most of you think you can stay objective. Well, in this scenario, it might be that it will be hard. Okay, I think we can continue with the presentation, the second part, which is managing the conflict of interest. So as we know, okay, now we can identify if the conflict of interest is actual, potential, or perceived, and what is most important is how to manage the conflict of interests. So a couple of remarks about managing the conflict of interest. Well, first, it's the conflicts of interest. It's natural that they will occur, um, and the fact that they will occur, it's not an evidence of any wrongdoing. What is important is that you can, once you recognize the conflict of interests, you'll be able to handle it in an appropriate way and avoid putting at risk your organization's integrity and reputation. And well, for many professionals, especially those who, like you, are in a position of being a board director or executive directors, etc., it's very common to be in a situation of conflict of interest from time to time. So this is not a major problem. What is important, as I mentioned, is also to identify the potential conflict mainly for two reasons. So first, it will enable board members to give some time to consider the implications and to respond appropriately. And then it will also help to avoid conflicts from either occurring or you can reduce them. I prefer to focus on managing conflict of interest than preventing it, because from its nature, sometimes we are not able to predict that some conflict of interest will arise, and preventing it's one of the ways you can manage conflict of interest. But there are other tools that you can use, or let's say other solutions that you might like to get, not just prevent the conflict of interest. What is helpful, for example, is to develop the conflict of interest policy. I will get back to the conflict of interest policy in a couple of slides. And right now, I just want to say that ideally, you should get all of the board directors to sign the conflict of interest policy and to implement it consistently and transparently. Well, the main aim of the conflict of interest policy is to minimize the risk of creating circumstances where a conflict could arise. And then the declaration of interest, it basically enables board directors to they give the chance to board directors to declare the interest before proceeding with the formal agenda. Usually you will fill it out, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, at least once per year and update it, but also as it should be a standard agenda item in during each board meeting. And also it would be good to inform potential and new directors that they'll be expected to declare their interest on appointment and then whenever a situation of conflict of interest may arise. Sometimes it can happen that you're not sure if there are some facts or that will lead to the potential conflict of interest. And as a director, I would suggest it's advisable to mention it among other board directors. It might be something that seems insignificant, but it's better sure to be clear, and then make sure that that this is also written in the meeting minutes. At the Alliance, we do have the template for the conflict of interest policy and for the declaration of interest. So I will share it with you after the presentation. But we also have it on our website in the governance section. So you can access this anytime. So before I will share the Alliance, I would say, recommended actions, I was wondering if you do, how do you manage the conflict of interest in your organization? If there's anything that you find um, really efficient, you can well, feel free to write it in the chat box below. It's always good to to share some solutions or best practices, and hopefully it will be similar to the one that we are using, or if not, maybe we can see if there's something that one of the organization uses, and maybe it's something that it's not a common solution. So let's see. And in the meantime, I will share with you. Okay. Uh, okay, you have terms of reference, the sign any appointment, um, and you have policy and declaration forms. Okay. As you can see, I did share specific actions which are maybe more broad. But what you are saying, yeah, it's something that we also have, and that's like a standard and efficient ways of managing conflict of interest. So while you are still typing, I'm just gonna go through the list that I have here on the slides. Removal, well, one of the best ways, but also more maybe the more the most harsh, is to remove the conflict altogether. It can be a situation where you will ban your employees from having an interest in partner companies. And also resignation. It is a way of solving the conflict of interest. Obviously, it's the most drastic one. So other ways like disclosure or refusal are something that we will use first. So disclosure basically helps to ensure that everyone who is involved in the decision-making process will disclose all the information and interests that could present a conflict. It can be, for example, financial information. And a refusal is a situation where individuals that are in the conflict of interest will abstain from participating in the decision. So it could be when the board directors will not vote on the agenda points in which they have a conflict of interest. It's what Margarita said, not voting in meetings on issues where conflict of interest exists. Alison, yes, well, sometimes not only voting part, but also discussion might reveal too many information that one of the person who is in conflict should not know. So in that situation, they should leave the room during this short discussion, and then they will be asked to come back to the room. Right. Also having code of ethics or code of conduct or declaration of good character might draw all the other options and situations, or maybe give some solutions in case of conflict of interest. Basically, whatever action is taken, make sure that this information is written, registered, either in the meetings minutes or in the register of interest. Register of interest, it's quite useful because you can record fact and information, but also it will enable you to recognize a conflict of interest, and hopefully also you'll be able to manage it. And once again, no matter how insignificant some information may seem, it's good to put it in the register of interest, especially because it will help to display transparency and governance practices to your stakeholders, members, and anyone who is outside of the organization. As I mentioned, I will get back to the conflict of interest policy. You see here there's a list of elements that might be included. I will not go one by one through them. There's two things I wanted to share with you. So first is the policy does not have to be complex. What is important is that it is reviewed regularly and then updated. And once again, it's important to communicate it widely, so not among board directors, but also the executive directors, but also the entire staff, because anyone can be in a situation of conflict of interest, potential conflict of interest. And obviously make sure that it's understood. And then secondly, so the elements that you will put in the conflict of interest policy should, well, they will depend on the nature of the organization and the governance structure. Well, as you can see, it's pretty, well, there's a common sense to put the purpose of the policy and the definition of the conflict of interest, but it's up to you if you want to put examples. Right in the DPR, you might mention something about data protection, but maybe for your organization, it will be more useful to mention, or well, yeah, mention there the acceptance of gifts procedure, or how do you manage the internal conflicts of interest, etc. So if you do have a conflict of interest policy, you can always compare it with our template. And if you will have questions about this, obviously we'll be happy to help you. We are just about to move to the final part of the presentation of the webinar, which are the risks associated with non-compliance. But before that, I have two more questions for you. So the first one, is, do you think that declaring a conflict of interest should make you feel embarrassed or uncomfortable? Okay, I think almost everyone voted. Yes, so as you can see, all of you said it's false. I guess it's also the way I did write the question. But in general, in fact, you're not declaring the conflict of interest. You're declaring facts and circumstances that might create conflict. And there is not any wrongdoing in that. And by declaring this, you're actually showing that you want to do things right. And also, one more remark is that sometimes let's say if you'll be appointed as a board director, you might not be in a situation of conflict of interest. You might not even have any facts to declare. But then later on, let's say after 1 year, you'll be appointed as a director or elected in another organization, or maybe your partner will start working in the organization you're sitting on board, and then you might have to declare this. So obviously, there is no reason that you should feel uncomfortable or embarrassed about that. And then another question is, do you think that pointing out a possible conflict of interest is an acceptable procedure? Okay, I think I can end this. I think almost everyone voted. You said it's true, and I agree. In fact, there should be a procedure that allow other people to who know about the conflict of interest to point it out. And again, there are several reasons to that. First is that sometimes the person who is in a situation of conflict of interest might not even realize that. And secondly, if you're able to see it, spot it, well, to notice that before the person who is in conflict of interest will realize that, it can just help you to identify a potential conflict quickly. And also, having this procedure will promote the culture of disclosure, and it's quite important to have that culture of disclosure in an organization. Okay, so I guess you're knowledgeable enough, and we can pass to the final part of the presentation about risks associated with non-compliance. And basically, I would say that managing the conflict of interest is the most important part of the webinar that I'd like you to remember. But why do we all talk about this? It's because risks related to non-compliance are quite significant. There might be not many of them, but as I said, they're quite important. So you can see it can be failing to deal with conflict of interest may lead to poor governance, and this leads to decisions that were not taken in the best interest of the organization. And it can actually mean that either the entire board or some of the directors did not act in the best interest of the organization. And this can seriously impair board's ability to make decisions. It can also affect the accountability and transparency of your organization. Financial damage is self-explicit, and it's again mostly because of decisions or actions were not taken in the best interest of the organization. And this obviously might lead to the financial damage, but it's, for example, when board directors have acted outside of the terms of the organization's governing document or the law. Failure to act properly in case of conflict of interest might also lead to a breach of board directors' legal responsibilities, and then it might be possible to made it as well that the decision that was made within the conflict of interest will not be valid and will be voided. And quite often this might lead to a civil lawsuit. So if your organization or company has approved that the board member profited from his or her role on the board, can file a lawsuit. A very important risk is a reputational damage, as failing to deal with conflict of interest might not necessarily be illegal, but it's almost certainly unethical, and you risk basically board directors should be aware that there might be significant negative effects on the organization's reputation, but also on public trust and confidence in general. And this also implies financial element to it, because it's quite hard to rebuild the reputation. You might work on your marketing, PR, etc., and that will cost you money, and you have no guarantee that the reputation will be restored. So that's why it's, you should make sure that you do have policies and procedures that are in place, as they will allow to demonstrate that you can handle such situations in an appropriate way. Also, poorly managed conflict of interest might harm working relationships and affect free discussion on the board level and beyond that. So it can also affect employees, executive staff, etc. On the board level, it might be a situation when, let's say, one of the board directors will not disclose a potential conflict of interest. And obviously it can damage the dynamics of the board, because this is one of the director's duties, and everyone sort of rely that all directors will behave in an honest way and will disclose their interests. It's hard basically to discuss and make decisions, including the person that didn't do that. And so this is, in terms of content, all I wanted to share with you. But I also have, I have one more question to ask you, and then I would like to share 2 examples of conflict of interest. So the final question is, does the removal should be automatic? What I mean by that is, do you think that the board director who is in a conflict of interest situation should be removed from the decision-making process? Okay, I still have few people who are hesitating, but I'll end the voting now. Well, you can see that you have different opinion about this. 50% of you say it's true, 133 say it's false, and it is false, especially for small size organizations, because it's very difficult to have completely independent board of directors. So sometimes it might be acceptable to directors that are in the situation of conflict of interest to participate in the decision-making process. It might be someone who has like expert knowledge about the topic. Although it's important to receive a prior consent from the rest of the board. Okay, and as I said, I do have 2 examples I'd like to share with you. I think it's always good to know that some other organizations are also in this situation of conflict of interest, and as I mentioned, it's not uncommon. And first example, it's is the FIFA scandal. It's basically too good not to mention it. I think you can recognize 2 gentlemen on this slide, Sepp Blatter and Michel Platini. And I'm not sure if you remember, but in 2015 there was this big case, the scandal about the payment that was made by Sepp Blatter to Michel Platini. It was for the sum of 2 million of Swiss francs, which is 1.2 million pounds, for a consultancy services that Michel Platini provided to FIFA between 1998 and 2002, and then he was paid for this, like roughly approximately 10 years later, and there was just a verbal agreement, and it was a classic conflict of interest, because well, I can even quote the chairman of the Audit and Compliance Committee, who said that in any normal business there should be a written contract. Then both parties were members of the executive committee, and they knowingly approved the financial statements that were incorrect every year for about nearly 10 years. So Blatter was president of FIFA and Michel Platini was the president of UEFA, but he was also a member of the executive committee. So, FIFA executive committee, and they did not share this information that they did. They made a payment of quite significant amount of money. So in the end, both were banned from participating from any football-related activities for 8 years, and they were also fined. Although this ban was reduced twice. The other example is in the world of boxing. So in general, something that is plaguing boxing is lack of regulation and oversight. There's no central authority in the form of national commission, and outside of amateur boxing and professional one, there's no structure, no tournaments, leagues or schedules. And in the middle of all this chaos, you have promoters who's setting up the deals and arrange the fights, but they also responsible for the travel, lodging, and food costs for the judges and the referee. And they also have direct ties to the manager of a boxer. So in short, boxing has a conflict of interest written all over it. As you can see on this slide, this is a fight from September last year between Gennady Golovkin and Canelo. The result was quite unlikely. It was a draw. Um, and well, this actually triggered the rematch clause, meaning that the enormous fight will be repeated again, and it will be in September, actually, hopefully. But it also means that the Nevada Sport Athletic Commission will again receive a lot of money. And the conflict of interest here, it's clear, is that the governing body is also having a financial stake in the outcome. Right, before we move to the Q&A session or part of the webinar, I'd like to wrap it up. So I'd like you to know, remember that conflicts of interest are common, and they might not represent any serious issue. They are actually unavoidable, but the way they are handled might create difficulties. As I mentioned as well in the beginning, there's no magical solutions. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. And again, conflict of interest rules are not complicated, but what can be difficult is to apply them, and also that the risk of non-compliance can be great. Sometimes you might have a situation that it's clearly about ethics, and it's just hard to manage the conflict in this situation. Also, reputation and integrity are at stake. So I used to say that how the board deals with the conflict of interest, it can be a good test of its moral standing, but also it shows what's the level of integrity and of each director and of the board. Although you do have the remedy actions that I mentioned and that some of you also share with us, which is the refusal, disclosure, declaration of interest, also putting all the potential conflicts or facts in the meeting minutes. To finish the webinar, I want to share the thought of Ronald Reagan, who said that peace is not absence of conflict, it is the ability to handle conflict by peaceful means. So there will always be conflict, but what matters most is the manner in which the conflict is solved. If you have any questions, you can ask them right now. You can also write on my email address, and I'll get back to you later. You might need a minute or two to think about a question. So I will share with you our next trainings. So we have the new governance training program from May up to March next year, and which includes workshops, webinars, and podcasts. And you can see the dates of our director's training. It's going to be in 2 weeks in Leeds, and then in October in London. And we also have a sports summit in July, which will focus on the topic, why have we failed our children? You will find more information about this on our website. Alison asked, what is my view on voting CEOs and conflicts of interests? So, Alison, do you mean that the CEO will be voting? I'm not sure if I understood your question correctly. Right, okay. So if the voting CEO will be in a situation of conflict of interest. Um, well, again, it depends. It depends on the situation. In many organization, the CEO will be sitting on the board, and uh, uh, if you have anything on the agenda that uh, you should vote on that. It just depends what is the topic and how the CEO is involved. And in some situations, they can stay, and sometimes they should not vote. And so this is mostly like case by case scenario. I hope that answers your question. And I think as well, yeah, there's often a perceived conflict as, yeah. So, well, in general, the chair of the organization, sorry, of the organization of the board, as it's his or her tasks, especially to monitor if there is a conflict of interest or not. Um, so it will be the chair's role to make sure that the CEO will be able to vote or not. Um, yes, it might be a perceived conflict, um, and I think, as I said, yeah, it will just depend uh, on what are you voting, on the item that you're voting on. Okay, I don't see any more questions. Um, I'll just go back to my slide with my email address. So if you do have any question about it, feel free to write me. And just to repeat that, we will send you an email with also with the feedback. So that'll be very helpful if you could uh, fill it out. And then once we do upload the webinar, the recording and slides on our website, you will receive the link. Okay, thank you and have a nice rest of the day. Oh, sorry, I got a question. Margarita asked, could the sports seminar on the children be available to a webinar? No, we don't plan that to run as a webinar. Yeah, it would be yeah, it's an event, so that would be you can participate in that, but unfortunately it won't be in the form of a webinar. Okay, thank you very much, and yeah, I'm looking forward to do a webinar again.